Hey guys, what's up? So in this video I wanted to do a little showcase of how you can create braided hair using Blender's hair particles and curve guide. Alright, so the first thing we're going to need is a hair emitter. So we're going to do Shift A and we're going to add a mesh plane. So now I want to adjust the size of this plane, make it a small plane so it's not too big, because working with a big particle emitter can slow down performance. So just making it a small size, enough to run smoothly. I'm going to go to the particles properties and I'm going to add a particle. And now let's change this to hair. So now we have our hairs. And the next thing we want to do is we want to rotate this so that the hairs are running along the x-axis. And the reason why we want to do this is because when we add our curve guide, the curve guide by default will come in running along the x-axis. And I haven't figured out a way for the braiding to work on any other axes other than the x-axis. And you'll see what I mean in a minute here. So now that we have our hair particles, let's go ahead and add our curves. So selecting the mesh here, I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to go to force field and curve guide. So we want to make sure that our plane is perfectly positioned at the starting point of our curve guide. So the circle that is solid is our starting point and the dash circle is our end point. So we want to select our plane, and we can do this a couple ways. We can enable our snapping to mode to vertex and then enable the snap to mode, and then we can press G to go in move mode and then press X to constrain it to the x-axis, and then we just hover over the endpoint and you'll see it pop. We can also just select our curve guide, press tab to go into edit mode, select the starting point, press Shift S, and then cursor to selected, and then we'll just select our plane and then we'll do Shift S, selection to cursor. So I'm going to turn off the snap to mode. So now with our plane emitter perfectly centered and positioned right where the starting point of our curve guide is, if we select our curve guide and go to the physics settings, let's change the type to braid. And now if I adjust some of the values here, frequency, you can see that the hair particles are being influenced. And if I adjust the amplitude, we can start seeing the different hair strands. So if we select our hair particles, we also want to make sure that we have enough resolution to work with. If I change the frequency as it is, you can see that the braids aren't acting the way we want them to. So if I go to my particle settings again, and if I go to render settings and viewport display, for viewport display, to see everything happening on the viewport, we want to adjust the strand steps on the viewport display. But we can also make the resolution higher for rendering. So I'm just gonna adjust the strand steps for viewport display all the way up to 7, just sliding it, and this one all the way up to the max of 9, just sliding it. So now we select our curve guide again and go to the physics settings, and now if I change the frequency, you can see that the curve guides are a little better, but the amplitude is still high, so I'm going to turn the amplitude down. So now you can see we have our braided hair looking much better, and you can add more frequency to it as well. And then we still have some other settings under the settings tab. we have clumping amount, and then we have shape for the clumping, and then you can also adjust the size of these circles for your curve guide. So now we have our braided hair with the hair particles, but we can't really do much else with this. If I rotate it on any other direction other than the x-axis, you'll see that the braids start overlapping each other and it gets all wonky. So a workaround that I thought of was to select the hair particles emitter, and then when we go to our modifiers properties, you can see that there's a particle system modifier, and if we convert this into a mesh, that'll create a duplicate of our hair curves or the hair particles, but as a mesh object. But we still can't really do much with this, and what I thought of was, what I really wanted to do was to be able to adjust them using the Blender's new hair curves and using the geometry nodes to tweak the look of the braid. Not the braid itself anyways, but the hairs on the braid. So what I thought of was converting this into a hair curves, which we can actually do. So if I select the hair braids mesh and then right click, if we try to convert it into a curve from a mesh, you're gonna get an error because we can only convert curves to hair curves. So the first thing we're gonna wanna do is convert this into a curve. And once you convert it into a curve, you will know if you get this little icon here. And now we want to convert this into a hair curves. So now we have successfully converted our hair particles into our hair curve. And if we do Control Tab to change the modes, we can go into sculpt mode. Whenever you have a hair curves on your scene and you do Control Tab, you can go into what's called the sculpt mode. It's really grooming mode, but it's called sculpt mode. You have grooming tools you can use to adjust the look of your hair. So here's the comb, and then you also have the grow and shrink. And you'll see that you want to keep in mind that these are still hair curves that are keeping the form of the hair braid, because that's what we converted our curves from. So if I use the comb tool and then completely comb across the hair, you can see it completely removes the braiding. So just to keep in mind, and when you're using the comb brush on it, you just need to try to be a little subtle with it. How you can reposition it is you basically rotate it in 3D space or move it in 3D space to reposition the hair. So to show you a finished example, so what I wanted was a way to quickly create braided hair. So I created this scene template which I can open up to quickly create some braided hairs, and then I can copy those braided hairs into my scene, my working scene, and then start positioning the hair and tweaking it to how I want it to look. So I had also created a Python script to generate my hair particles for me with the curve guide. And to create the Python script, I basically used a template, and you can find the templates to create like panels under the templates in Python, and then you can do like a UI panel template. So with the template, you'll get like the starting structure of what you need to get your script going. So up here is just the information for the script, and this will show up under the add-on when I go to preferences. And I have my own category of tools that I create for my own workflow. And then here you'll see, if I open up one of them like the braided here, you'll see all these information. That's all this stuff over here. So here I'm just calling the properties and the arguments that I need, and then below that is the starting point of my functions. So the first one we have here, it's a braid create. So this, and under the braid create function, is where it goes through all the process of creating the hair. So first we have setting the cursor to the world origin so that we make sure our hair plane is placed on the world origin, so we can move it to the specific direction in a certain amount that we want. And then I'm creating a new collection here. So it's important that we create a new collection, and the collections are just like layers, and you can see there's these bins, so you can see all these different collections that says hair braids. It's important that each hair braid you create is under its own collection with the curve guide, because if you go to the particle settings and go under the field weights, we're going to need to turn off all the force settings except the curve guide and all, because all will turn all off. And after we do that, we're going to need to reference our collection, because if we don't do that, the curve guide will affect all the other hair particles that's around it or that's in the scene. So having everything under its own collection will sort of exclude anything else that's outside of that collection. So that's what we're doing here. We're creating that collection, and then here I'm starting to add the plane with the size, and then making selected active, and then you create the hair particles, and then I'm adjusting settings here, and then naming some things. It's really useful to name objects that are added through Python, because then we can call those objects. And then here I'm just laying out some of the settings that I need for my hair particles, and then you can see this is all the field weight stuff. I'm putting all the other force fields to 0 except my curve guide. By default everything is at 1. So then here I'm naming the modifier here, the particle system modifier, and then here we start adding the curve guide, and then we can then adjust the settings to get our base started. And then after all of that, I'm setting the scene collection up here as the active. So initially when we created our new collection, the hair braids collection, we had set it to be the active, because that way whatever object we add in the scene will pop up or will be under the active collection. So at the end of everything, at the end of all the process, I'm just setting the scene collection back as the active collection. So after the braid create function, I'm just calling some of the settings under the hair particles. So we go to hair particles, we can see there it has its own parameters. So here I'm just calling the other parameters here. So the braid axis, the x-axis, and then y is the y. But I haven't really had much success using this axis parameter. The braid seems to only want to run on the x-axis. So those are just like additional stuff that I have on my script. And then after that is the braid frequency, braid shape. And so these are just like float properties that I'm using to create my float parameters, my sliders, so that I can then use these functions to call out these parameters down here. So whenever I update this function or my custom parameter, it'll update this. So then after all those parameter functions, I have a generate hair curves. This is to take the hair particles that we have set up and then convert it into the hair curves at the end, after we are satisfied with how our braid looks and the shape of it. After the functions up here, these are like the classes for operators, and then under those are the classes, the menu. This is where we start setting up the panel layout, adding our buttons or sliders, whatever kind of properties we need, and then naming them. And then finally I am registering all the classes that I have made. So here I'm putting my classes under a list so that I can just call this variable menus. So the menus equals a list of classes. So the first one is braided, and it's the only one. It's probably going to be the only one, but I am just calling those menus here under the register, and then registering all the classes that are under that list under this variable. So for m in menus, and then call register the m. And then below that we have our float parameters and our bool parameters. And then after the register, we want to unregister everything. This is just whenever you open Blender, it registers all these custom parameters. And then when you close Blender, it unregisters everything. So that's the setup for the script. It's not crazy, it's nothing too long, it's actually really short. Yeah, this is really short for a script. And it's just one Python script, so it's not like structured in a folder with other scripts or anything like that. So just keeping it really simple there. Oh, and so the way I knew what commands I needed was, I mean, I did research on my own part as well, but for like Blender specific commands, like to add an object, you can use your listener right here. If you hover over your viewport and then you add an object like a plane, you'll see that the command to add a plane will pop up in the listener. So bpy.obs.mesh.primitive plane add, and then all the specific parameters to set. So you can use that to like automate process in Blender, but you'll also need to do some research on your own part to get like some of the structuring right. So the Python script is here, placed in the panels, and you'll see there's a button here, and if you click this button, it'll automate the entire process of creating the hair braids. So if I click this button, you'll see it'll create the hair braids along with the curve guides. And then I also have all these settings that are tied with the settings you use to adjust the curve guide settings. So I can adjust the size of the curve guide endpoints. If I still have the curve guide selected, I can adjust the frequency, the amplitude, and I can also add clumping, adjust the shape for the clumping. So not a lot of parameters for this because my intention was just to quickly create braided hair, and then I can use geometry nodes to adjust the look of all the hairs on the curve. Not the braid itself, but just the hairs. All the braiding look is going to be done before the hair curves. So here I can adjust the braid settings to get the look that I want, or the frequency, the amount of braiding I want. And then after I'm satisfied with that, I'll select the hair particle emitter, and then I'll do convert to hair curves. And now we have our hair curves. And I have another hair curves here that I have created all my geometry nodes with the parameters that I can use to influence this new hair curve here. So if I select this and select the one with all the parameters, and I do Control L and copy modifiers, you'll see all the parameters from this is going to be applied to this new hair curve. And the starting point is going to be attached to whatever surface is active on the hair surface. So if I rotate this up you can see that all the starting points are still intact, and it's all sliding across the hair surface. So this little orange dot here is the origin point for this object, or for this hair curve. And if I wanted to rotate, if I want to rotate it from its base, I simply just position the cursor here, and then with the object selected, I'll go to Object, set the origin to 3D cursor. So now my origin is at the base of this hair, of this braided hair curves here, and now I can rotate it and position it however I want. And I can even go to sculpt mode and then sculpt the hair. But remember, we want to be a little gentle with how much force we put into the sculpting. If you want to change the direction, you simply rotate it. So with all this set up, and now that we have our geometry node parameters applied, I can adjust the look of this curve. So if I go to the materials, and I go to material, add a new one, and I'll just call this hair. Then I'll change the material to principled hair. And then I like to use the melanin concentration. And then I'll change the tint to like blonde. And let's add a little, actually there's a light object in here already. So now let's view this in rendered mode. So we're not seeing our material because we need to go to the modifiers, and then we need to add the hair material under it. So you can see that the hairs are really thin, and if I select this, let's actually select this one and then turn it down, turn the interpolation down just so it can be a little smoother when I render performance wise. So if we go back into rendered view, you can see that the hairs are really thin, but we have parameters to adjust the thickness of the hair. We have parameters to adjust the root radius and the tip radius. So I can go to the root radius and set this to like 0.01. So now we can clearly see our hair and everything is visible. So we have our braided hair there, and we can adjust the materials to change the color. And then if we go back to solid view, we also have capabilities of adjusting all the hairs, tweaking all the hairs on the braid to give it a little more uniqueness. So we have distribution, and then we also have clumping, and then we also have noise. We can add noise to the hair, and then we can adjust the amount of noise. So the noise is just using a noise texture, and then I also added a noise capability for the tip of the hair, and we can adjust how much noise there is, and we can also adjust how much of the tip is being affected by the noise. So if I turn this up, it can get really messy. You can see how it's sort of interpolating along the hair curves, or traveling along the hair curves. And then we also have a hair trim, and we can either set it to hair trim random, or we can do hair trim like this, where it's a sharp cut. all these parameters are set up through geometry nodes. And if we go to geometry nodes and look at the graph here, you can see my group node, and then inside this group node is where everything is happening, and then these are all my inputs where I can plug in and create all my custom names for the custom parameters. If I select my group node here and then press tab on the keyboard, you'll see this is where all the backend stuff are happening. So we have resample and duplicate, distribute and clumping, we have hair surface. This is to attach the starting points to whichever model we set as the hair surface. This is radius for the hair curves. This is the root radius and tip radius. We have a global noise. We have global noise and the tip noise. So here we have the global noise, and then here we have the tip noise, and we're using the endpoint selection to select the end point. But I have that plugged into the input so that we can adjust the value, the amount of how much of the starting from the endpoint traveling to the starting point, how much is being affected. And then here we have hair trim and random trim. So I basically have it under like a Boolean switch. If it's true, then we're going to use the random trim, but if it's not true, we're just using the regular trim. And then here's just the material and the output node. So that's pretty much all that I have set up for this one. And if we press tab again, this is the base of the graph. And all this allows me to tweak the look of my hair. So yeah, this was a really cool project that allowed me to quickly create braided hair that I used for my Galadriel work in progress portrait. And this was done by using hair particles and then creating the braided hair look, and then converting all that into hair curves where I can use my custom geometry node set up for hair curves to adjust the look of the hair curves. So I hope you guys found this video informative and valuable if you did not know already how you can create braided hair in Blender and use Blender's new hair curves.